during the 29 general election, Jeremy Corbyn sort of provided some documents that actually showed that people in government and the Department of Health and Social Care had already had conversations with their opposite numbers in the USA about the USA having access to the NHS. And this has been an issue rumbling along for 2 or 3 years now. Are the Tories planning to open up the NHS to the Americans in return for a post-Brexit trade deal?
So, welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today, I'm talking to Andrew Godsell. He's a British writer born in Hampshire, author of, amongst other books, A History of the Conservative Party, the first critical history of the British Conservatives, The World Cup, the most comprehensive book at the time, at least, we think, of a history of the World Cup, and other books like Legends of British History, 15 Minutes of Fame, and Planet Football. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you, thanks.
No problem. Now, we'll probably get to some of your other stuff later, but the reason that I asked you on in the first place was to talk about some of your work talking about NHS privatisation. Now,
right, okay.
I have had, I don't know how many conversations with people talking about the NHS being privatised, and it's one of the things I talk about in my book, Brexit, the Establishment Civil War, as something to watch out for post-Brexit. And yet every time I bring this topic up, I get two reactions, right? I get either, oh, the NHS is totally not being privatized. That's not happening. You're just talking rubbish. Or it's someone being terrified that it is already privatized and essentially gone. Like, where, in your mind at least, is the reality here?
I would say the reality is it is a major threat. It is happening. It's not, obviously, I would say, yeah, the idea that it's gone is rescuable, but definitely the trends of the last 10 years are speeding up, and the situation is dire. A lot of people say we've moved from a system that was a national system to a system that effectively is a franchise, and it's almost like the NHS logo is there to make us think the NHS exists in its old format, but it doesn't. I think the sense in 2013, the Conservative government carried out the most drastic reorganisation of the NHS since it started in 1948. And a lot of people say there's been a campaign that's called the NHS Reinstatement Bill, the idea that a bill will go to Parliament to basically reset the clock back to 1948 to 2013, because the 2013 reorganisation opened it up to a lot more competition. One thing that does get forgotten is in the legislation, the responsibility of the Secretary of State for Health to oversee the NHS and oversee it in a way to make sure it did flourish and exist. That was quietly taken out of his remit, which a lot of people said, well, that is just amazing that happened. So yes, I would say increasingly privatisation is happening. I've got plenty of examples I can talk about as we go. But to answer your question, yes, it's still there, but it is in a lot of danger.
So what were some of the changes that happened with this reinstatement bill in 2013? And like what original sort of founding principles did it take away?
The reinstatement bill is the attempt to reverse the 2013 Health and Social Care Act.
Sorry, that's
the reinstatement bill.
The reorganisation.
Sorry, yeah. So the 2013 reorganisation, it introduced the CCGs, the clinical commissioning groups, which at a local level actually commission care. The providers of the care are the NHS Trust and NHS Foundation Trust, but increasingly also the private sector, the likes of Virgin and Care UK and Spire and Nuffield, BMI. Also, something that does quite often get overlooked is the role of the GP. So originally GP surgeries just got their money from the government and they were part of the core NHS. They're all now on private contracts with NHS England. So although people see a CCG is an aggregation of all the GPs in a particular city or geographical area. They're not effectively, they sit as a sort of a separate silo. So increasingly, I mean, there was a lot of publicity a week or so ago that Centene, a US company, has bought up 49 GP practices in London and surrounding area, because basically, say it's a private contract. It's not guaranteed that your GP is part of the NHS. Basically, any organisation can bid for a contract, and that's increasingly what's happening. So, also I mentioned KUK. They have a lot of units within NHS hospitals, and also they own some GP surgeries. And the main reason that increasingly private operation is happening within NHS hospitals is simply capacity. It's an amazing fact, which I was amazed when I first saw it, and I thought, is that really true? And asked somebody, where did they find it? The NHS was founded in 1948, at a time when we had 50 million people in the country. We've now got, well, we'll find out soon because the census is due, we've got approximately 70 million people in the country. So we've got a 40% increase in population. We've actually got less hospital beds now than we had 70 years ago. And most of that decrease has happened since the days of Margaret Thatcher. I don't want to bamboozle you with facts, but I did write this one now because it's quite surprising. In 1987, Britain had 299,000 hospital beds. The last time a sort of a general across the board national count was done a couple of years ago, it was down to 141,000. So in just over 30 years, the amount of hospital beds, public NHS hospital beds, has halved. So that's why there is increasing need. Well, the government argues there's an increasing need for private sector involvement in the NHS to pick up, because they argue that the waiting lists are going up. So the way to deal with this is to outsource to private organisations that can do the work. Whereas people who are arguing, sort of, say the NHS Reinstatement campaign is basically stop the privatisation. You don't need a private sector in the NHS. Basically, all you're doing is you're diverting money ultimately to shareholders of these private organisations. You need a fully funded national service. You actually just need to, the simplest way to do it is just to increase the capacity of the NHS, just basically have more hospitals and more beds.
One of the things that like concerns me whenever I see stories like this is I always wonder like just how deliberate the underfunding is, because like one of the things that comes up quite often in this debate is the idea that the Conservatives are like deliberately underfunding or running down the quality of the service of the NHS in order to then have the justification to privatize it, because it's such like a, for whatever reason, it's like a British institution. People love it. It's like, for example, here in Northern Ireland, we have it, but the south of Ireland has a much more privatized health system. And one of the things that I genuinely would consider, and I think I'm not alone here, is if we had like a vote whether we wanted to be part of a united Ireland, the fact that they don't have the NHS would be a huge thing for me. Like that would be a huge part of whether I wanted to vote to be a part of Ireland or not, just because it's, it's a little bit selfish, but I like my free healthcare, like personally and as a principle.
Yes.
But like how deliberate do you think this is, this like running down of the quality of like NHS services? Because you could attribute the drop of beds in a way, in to some extent at least, to the fact that people are not staying in hospital as long as they used to. They're getting treatment at home, maybe in their like care home or whatever. Like you could attribute some of the reduction in beds to that. But how much do you think of it is about like just purposefully running down the quality of the NHS?
I do think ideologically the Conservatives have always disliked the NHS. I mean, basically it was founded by a Labour government in 1948. When the legislation went through Parliament in 1946, the Conservatives actually voted against it. not and repeatedly voted at each stage of the legislation against it. And actually, in recent years, when Jeremy Hunt was Health Secretary, he tried to rewrite history and said, but the white paper was actually issued by the wartime coalition government, and there was a chap called Henry Willink who was Health Secretary, was a Conservative, and he was the mastermind of the plan. But he, and I have checked this, he himself actually voted against legislation, and he said, because basically it came out originally out of the Beveridge report, and I've read a book about Bevan wrote during the Second World War, and he didn't know at the time he was going to be the sort of the architect of the NHS, but he wrote about the plans for it, and he actually quotes Willink saying, "Yes, I support the Beveridge report, but I don't support all of it." So basically, right from the start, the Conservatives were opposed to this idea of a sort of a national, paid for by taxation and national insurance service that's free at the point of use. But effectively, because it was so successful and so popular, they had to accept it until Thatcher, because her mantra was basically she didn't believe in the big state, she didn't believe in the public utilities, and she was the one who started to chip away at the NHS and introduce this idea of an internal market, like everything should be sort of competitive and people should sort of be looking to, I mean, it started off with things like outsourcing cleaning and stuff. But in terms of where we are now, the trouble is the Conservatives will argue, and basically they made of a thing. The general election was at the end of 2019. At the start of 2020, they brought in the NHS Funding Act, and they said we are going to spend more money on the NHS than has ever been spent before, and we're going to enshrine this in law. Now, in a sense, every government always spends more on the NHS than any previous one, just because inflation and the size of the population goes up. But the actual rate of increase of funding, and again, I jotted down the figure, across the history of the NHS, funding has increased by 3.7% per annum on average. Since the Conservatives took power in 2010, the average has dropped to 1.4%. So although in cash terms, they are spending more money on the NHS than anyone before, and they said, oh yes, we've made a big thing, we've put this in law, in real terms, they're not. And in real terms, they are, as I went through like the 2013 reorganisation, what I say to people is, as well as privatising the service, they're actually fragmenting it. They're making it more, there's more and more different bodies within the NHS being created. It causes it causes confusion and distrust, because people, if they've got a problem with the NHS, they don't know where to go to. And they don't, the simple model of the government, the initial model was the government would basically dish out X millions of pounds to each hospital, to each GP surgeries in a certain area, and they would just treat their local patients. Then this idea of patient choice came in, that if you want to have your procedure done, theoretically, you can have your procedure done anywhere in England if you're in England. If you say, oh yes, and people can argue, it might be that your local hospital can do that procedure, but you end up going to the other end of the country because you can, there's evidence that another hospital can do it better. But all it does, and another thing is, there's this giant internal market where different parts of the NHS are battling against each other for scarce resources. And it literally, like I said, like this NHS Reinstatement campaign reckons that the actual cost of running this internal market is about £10 billion a year. So that's money sucked out of patient care to pay for an army of sort of contract people, finance people, legal people. And it's all the NHS's money. We all should be part of one big team, but increasingly it's fractured and fragmented. Sorry, you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, you were looking at sorry. Okay.
No, I was just don't worry. So like you talk about the fragmentation and the cost of that internal market. Like one of the arguments that would be made, at least, is that the fragmentation and the sort of like decentralization would be like an asset and a virtue, not like a hindrance, that by, you know, trying to decentralize control, you can have things that are, I don't know, more responsive in real time, that you can sort of better allocate resources in like local environments. Like, why do you think it's important to have it as a just a single, like, top down state run body, as opposed to like a whole bunch of different groups?
The problem is, and I mean, I work in the NHS myself, and I work in patient funding. I'm always very careful because I've had discussions with my employers, and also because I did stand. We might talk about this later. I did stand for local council election in my area, where there was quite a big hot topic to do with the NHS walking centre being closed. So I always have to be. I always want to be careful. I always say anything I say is stuff that's in the public domain. It's not stuff that I know because I work there. I work in patient funding, so there are increasingly there are some they're called procedures of limited clinical value, where effectively before your GP would say, if you want a hip replacement, a knee replacement, if you've got carpal tunnel or trigger finger, effectively your GP would just say, yes, you need this done, you can go to the hospital. Now criteria are being set up for all these procedures, and there's about 30 of them nationally. The problem is each clinical commissioning group then decides its own criteria. So when people talk, say, for example, the thing that quite often turns up in the media is what they call the postcode lottery, to do with IVF, assisted conception, that different areas have an age limit for the point at which they'll stop funding women to do this, or how many attempts they'll get. So it's really unfair. It seems that some areas say that they will stop assisted conception at the age of 35. So in Hampshire it's 35, but you go to Farnham in Surrey, which is 5 miles over the border, and it's 38. And if you move, you have to reapply for funding. So it seems to me, why are people in the county of Hampshire any different from people in Surrey, Birmingham, Liverpool, wherever? It just doesn't seem to me that we need, in every city and every county, people making decisions about criteria when effectively we're all the same. I can understand, say, an area like a deprived inner city, where they might want to invest extra resources in particular projects to improve, say, people's health and well-being. But generally across the country, I'm not saying we need a one size fits all. The government, the argument against the state is the government, the man in white knows best, and everybody has to do what they say. But I don't understand the need for so much fragmentation and so many decisions that are going to be made. And it does seem that it's, like I said, a postcode lottery. Sometimes it does seem very, what's the word I'm looking for? It does seem a bit arbitrary, the way that one city will make a decision different to another. I just feel that if we, so I say to people, we don't need to look far for a model that works. Wales and Scotland, I must admit, actually, I don't know much about the NHS in Ireland, Northern Ireland, but in Wales, they have local health boards, and the same in Scotland. There's very little private sector input, and basically a local health board in Wales whereas before in England, you've got the CCGs commission the service, and the NHS trusts and the private sector organisations provide the service. In Wales, you've got the health board, effectively does both parts of the role. So it's commissioning it itself effectively to provide hospital services. And that seems a much clearer model, because you're not bringing in all this, as I say, like all this sort of legal and contractual and financial barriers to things. Basically, I said the simple model is, if every big city and every county had several what they called super hospitals that can do everything, and everybody was encouraged to go to the local hospital with the confidence that their local hospital can do everything, that would be a much simpler system and a much more efficient system in my mind. And that was sort of the founding principle for decades, and we've gone away from that in the last few years.
I think that's like a key point to make sure, like, this isn't things that you're proposing that have never been tried. Like, that's just how it used to run.
It used to run, and that's what we want back. Yes.
So, like, what do you look at as being the areas of concern at the moment in terms of privatization of different NHS services? Like, where is this happening where people don't realize?
Well, I've already spoken about Centene and buying up the GP practices, and they are a US company. And of course, there was argument during the 29 general election. Jeremy Corbyn sort of provided some documents that actually showed that people in government and the Department of Health and Social Care had already had conversations with their opposite numbers in the USA about the USA having access to the NHS. And this has been an issue rumbling along for 2 or 3 years now. Are the Tories planning to open up the NHS to the Americans in return for a post-Brexit trade deal? And people are saying it's not going to happen. The government's basically, there's a trade bill that's been going through Parliament the last few months, and the opposition parties have tried to get a clause added to say the NHS is off the table. It will not form part of any trade deal. And the government keeps saying, voting against it, voting it down. The Tory MPs say, well, we're voting it down because it's a ludicrous idea. This is never going to happen. But the reality is it's already happening. Now, one of the big moves, basically only 8 years on from the 2013 reorganisation, there have been more reorganisations, and the current thrust of the reorganisation in England is to go to what's called integrated care systems. Now, on the surface, it looks nice because the idea is that all of the different NHS plus private providers within a particular, they're normally on a county basis, will integrate more to achieve economies of scale. I mean, here in Hampshire, we've got like 8 CCGs, and the idea is they're all going to merge into one super CCG. So this idea, I said, look, there's different disparities in the way they deal with things. But the super CCG will work alongside the hospital. So it all looks nice, and think, oh yes, this is better economies of scale. This is going to be more efficient. The thing that the government don't tell you is, and also it was portrayed in the media, there'll be less contracting with the private sector. But what the reality is, there'll be less small short-term contracts with private sector providers, and the scope for actually having big contracts that last 10, 15 years. Now in Hampshire, the shadow integrated care system, because the legal basis for this hasn't been established, because the government originally, when Theresa May didn't have a majority, they just couldn't get it through Parliament, and obviously with COVID and everything else and Brexit's happening. But the plan is to actually get the legal basis for it this year. But the Hampshire integrated care system, there's something that's becoming a big issue is called health population management. The idea of lots of data about who your people are, what sort of illnesses they're affecting people in a particular population, sort of what treatments are happening, recovery times. This is a massive market, and there's a lot of US companies that are experts in this market and are increasingly trying to buy into it. And the Hampshire, although the capacity to do this work exists in the NHS, in Hampshire, they have Hampshire and Isle of Wight, they've actually recently let a contract to a company called Cerner, which is a US-based multinational, to do this work, rather than invest in existing NHS provision. Again, also something that's happening increasingly is the NHS Trust will actually, this one really does surprise me, a lot of people, occupational health for NHS staff, which used to be run by the NHS. So if NHS staff have got a long-term illness, how will it affect their work? They will go and see an NHS nurse or doctor. Now that is increasingly being outsourced to private companies. Again, you look quizzical. The argument is some of these private companies have got more staff and they can see you quickly, and they've got more appointments available. But my argument is, but you're disinvesting in the NHS, because if you've got an NHS as an NHS employee, if I've got a health issue, I'd like to see an NHS clinician rather than someone from private sector company. So effectively, where that capacity exists in the NHS to do that work, you're disinvesting it if you're actually paying as an NHS body money to a private company to do that work. So so my argument, yes, it is happening, and increasingly companies from the USA are interested in it. I mean, the integrated care system model, which I've mentioned, originally it was called accountable care organizations, which is the very name that they use in the USA. And the idea is there that an accountable care organization gets given however many millions or billions for a year to provide care for its population. If they successfully manage to ration that care, because they've got private sector involvement, effectively any money they don't spend, they can keep, which again is there doesn't seem to be any safeguard to prevent that happening in Britain. So it's not clear who the ultimate budget holders will be for these organisations that have been set in embryo at the moment, and the scope for private sector involvement and private sector profiteering from them. So it's a bit technical, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I mean, if anyone's interested in just how screwed up the US healthcare system is, I did an interview with Dr. David Belk that I will link in the description, who wrote a book all about the ways in which the insurance industry essentially makes the cost just skyrocket. And he told me the story about a woman who was who he prescribed medication I can't remember the name of. Essentially he prescribed it to her, and through her insurance it was going to cost like $1,000 a month, and she went to Costco and bought it for like 50. So yeah, if anyone wants to understand just how screwed up and how we don't want that, then have a listen to that. So you mentioned actually that you're that you work in the NHS. Like, what do you do, and why do you like believe and campaign and write so passionately about wanting to save the NHS?
I used to say to people, I was born in an NHS hospital and I was educated in a comprehensive school. So right from the start, I've always believed in the importance of public services. I've been a member of the Labour Party throughout my adult life. I'm a little bit disenchanted with under new management, they call it. I've always been quite from the radical wing of the Labour Party, but always loyal to the party, and not necessarily always agreeing with the leader or the policies. I have stood for local elections several times. About a year after I started working for the NHS, I touched on it earlier, I stood for a Labour Party in my home city of Southampton, and there was a big issue locally that we had a walk-in centre which was due to be closed. The argument of it being closed was that the money was needed to put money into community nursing. But basically, Southampton's a city where there's a lot of, most of the NHS facilities are cities basically divided by a river, and most of the NHS facilities are on the west side of the city. There's two hospitals, they're both in the west side, and this NHS walk-in centre was a really important resource for out of hours people who couldn't, when the GPs were closed in the evenings and the weekends, which was serving the east half of the city. Unfortunately, after a major battle, it did get closed down. The plan is, well, there is still hope that it might be reinstated. So it's something, so obviously I've always felt passionately about the NHS. In the last 7 years, I've worked for the NHS and been involved in campaigns locally. So it's grown. And I've been tweeting relentlessly about the NHS, particularly during COVID. I feel that COVID, the crisis, has increasingly shown up the the unfitness of the Conservative government to run the NHS. And I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of publicity in the last few days about the test and trace fiasco. The budget for test and trace was 22 billion in the financial year we're coming towards the end of, and in the budget last year the government put 15 billion in for next financial year, so that's 37 billion pound. The House of Commons Public Accounts Committee released a report yesterday saying there is not much evidence that it's been effective. The trouble is the government are branding it as NHS test and trace, but most of the work has been outsourced to Serco, who in turn have outsourced a lot of the work to other organisations, G4S, Randox, Amazon. You're shaking your head, you know all about these things. I mean, one of the most striking things is it's just a massive amount of money, 37 billion pounds. And one thing that gets overlooked is there's a massive conflict of interest, because Edward Arger, who's one of the ministers of state at the so effectively Matt Hancock's deputy, he's one of the health ministers. Until a few years ago, he was an executive at Serco. The chief executive of Serco is Rupert Soames, who is brother of Nicholas Soames, who was a Conservative MP until the last general election for many decades, and grandson of Winston Churchill. So there's a very close link between the Conservative Party and Serco and many other of these other outsourcing companies. And it's just a phenomenal amount of money. And obviously, on top of that is also all the billions of pounds spent on sourcing PPE during the pandemic. And there's been a lot of reporting about a lot of companies that had no previous experience of sourcing PPE have been given multi-million-pound contracts. And a lot of these companies are people who sort of rapidly set themselves up, and then the trail goes back and it turns out a lot of them are actually friends and family and donors of the Conservative Party. And there's this what's called the VIP lane, which again the government hasn't been transparent about how certain companies were given preferential access to contracting. And it got to the stage where a couple of weeks ago, because the contracts hadn't been published within the legal timetable, Matt Hancock was actually taken to court, and the High Court actually judged that he'd broken the law. He said, "Oh, well, we were busy procuring PPE. We didn't have time to issue the contract." You think, well, the contract documents are already existing. They've presumably been emailed to somebody. It doesn't take long just to bung PDFs of them on the government website. So the suspicion is it was an attempt to cover up the extent of this fiasco. And then literally a few days after Matt Hancock was found to have broken the law, Boris Johnson stood up in Parliament and said, "Oh, we've been transparent. We've now published all the contracts." So then there was another court hearing 3 days later, at which point it was established that over 100 of these contracts still hadn't been published. And it just frustrates me that not just in terms of NHS privatisation, but well, beyond frustration, anxiety, anger, millions of us are feeling it. We just have a government that has made a its response to COVID has been shocking. We've got the official death toll is 125,000, but that only includes, they work that on the basis of people who've had a positive COVID test within and died within 28 days of that test. The actual total on the government's website based on death certificates is 140,000, which seems to me to be a more accurate measure of how many people have died. Chris Whitty, as the NHS Chief Medical Officer, said only a couple of days ago, we could be looking at another 30,000 deaths. And just the combination of the death toll, which per head of the population is one of the worst in the world, and the enormous amounts of money that have been spent on an inefficient response to it, or just despair. And the problem is, it seems that the government and the media, it's like test and trace is portrayed as a failure in some way of the NHS, even though most of the work isn't being done by the NHS, whereas the The good thing that has been success is obviously the rapid speed of development of vaccine and the rollout of the vaccine, which is scientists plus the NHS that done that, but the government are taking a lot of credit for the effectiveness of that. So, I mean, one of the things that does frustrate me is the way the mainstream media portrays things, but then we all know the way done, and that's why we have independent media. That's why you and I are talking today. So yes, so well, I said it's sorry, I'm probably smiling, but because I try to be a positive person, and I try to I know a lot of people are very really upset, really distraught, very anxious about the whole situation, and it just, I think if we'd been told a couple of years ago there would be a pandemic, 140,000, potentially 170,000 people would die, billions would be wasted on an inefficient response, and people would say it wouldn't happen here. So a message is, again, with the NHS, privatisation, the government say it won't happen, but increasingly it is happening.
I mean, there's so much to kind of I'm attempting to reserve my comments on the death toll until we have I know there's going to be either a court case or a public inquiry into like just how accurate the death toll is, high or low, just based on some of the amount of people that had COVID put on their death certificate without a test, or just I'm reluctant to comment on the numbers until we have like an actual assessment of how accurate they are. But like for me, the big thing is like the pure kleptocracy that's gone on, and the test and trace system is the third most expensive project in human history.
Is it really? I know it was. Oh.
The only two things, I do. The two things that have cost more is the US interstate highway system and the International Space Station. Those are the only two projects that have cost more than test and trace, or at least
didn't realize
that's the fact that's doing the rounds at the minute. I could be wrong.
No, I've not seen that. Actually, to come back to the 37 billion, I said that basically it was quietly increased. The budget was quietly increased in the budget on Wednesday last week. On Thursday, the government announced the offer of a 1% pay rise to NHS staff, and because we can't afford more than that. And I mean, I'm part of a campaign. It's called NHS Pay 15. Basically, it's to give across the board all NHS staff a 15% pay rise, basically just to reverse the real terms pay cut over a decade of Tory austerity, where pay rises there's been pay freezes in most years and very small pay rises in other years. And the cost of giving all of the NHS a 15% pay rise this year would be less than £8 billion. But we can't. I mean, basically, I was saying, come back to this NHS Funding Act that the government enshrined in law, the NHS funding a year ago, built in, that was based on the budget. The budget assumption was that there would be a 2.1% pay rise for this coming year for all NHS staff. And that was enshrined in law, but is now a 1% offer, or at least a 1% recommendation from the government to the pay review body, on the basis that NHS staff should be grateful they're getting a 1% pay rise, which in terms with compared with inflation is actually going to be a pay cut for next year, because other people have had their pay frozen. But as we know, their pet projects, there's always billions for them.
Yeah, they throw money at it.
It's like HS2 and various other things. The government, and again, we were told for years, austerity, we can't afford these things. But then with pandemic, and I mean, putting people on furlough is a good idea, but suddenly billions, the government could, and basically, again, this is something that's become increasingly a topic of conversation in the last few days. The government can afford to do that because it doesn't borrow money. It just asks the Bank of England to print more money, which it notionally borrows at a 0% interest rate, well, at a 0% interest rate, because the government and the Bank of England are just two arms of the state apparatus. So it's not as though we're going to have to, obviously, there is a national debt, which is like £2 trillion, and it goes up each generation, and each generation borrows on the basis that the next generation will pay for it. But then that is how, I mean, a lot of it, I'm not going into the history of the national debt, a lot of it was to fund wars. But then at the end of the Second World War, we had a Labour government that built the NHS. It built 1 million, and Aaron Bevan was the health manager, so the health minister. He joked, and because his role was health and housing, and he said, I'd probably spend like an hour a week on housing matters. But he oversaw a programme of 1 million council houses were built in 6 years of that Labour government. And we, like child benefit, the welfare state, a whole load of things were done. And it was consciously, the country was in ruins, both sort of, physically in ruins, the housing stock was run down. The financial situation was dire because we'd had to borrow loads of money from the Americans. But it was a conscious plan of the country deserves better. After 2 world wars in the space of a quarter of a century, our people deserve better. We will invest in our future. And that sort of political settlement of we will have nearly full employment, we will have prosperity, people will get increasing better sort of political and social rights. That settlement sort of held good for 30 years or more until Thatcher started to undermine it. And unfortunately, the thing that frustrates me is people get cynical about politics. People start to believe it's like the MP's expenses scandal of a decade ago. It's like all politicians are the same. They're all only in it for their egos and their money. And people, I think as a country, we can do a lot better. We have done better in the past. We can do better again. I mean, we're moving into much wider issues, but that's the thing that's something that really keeps me focused on politics, is the belief that ultimately we will have a government. So it's a question of, I feel, the people with the good ideas and the goodwill who believe in a better society rather than a selfish society. Everybody just thinks about their own short-term financial gain. That's what motivates me to be involved, and has always motivated me throughout my adult life. I just believe that we deserve so much better than the current government has given us. It frustrates me that obviously millions of people see differently, but perhaps people's opinions will change. But
I mean, that's difficult. Like it becomes not an issue of like what side of you stand on certain things. It's like it's what's your priority kind of issue, I think, is what comes down to leading people to vote Conservative, even though they care about the NHS. They don't see it as like being under threat or as big a priority as, I don't know, like shutting down the woke people or whatever it is. But you mentioned you are not a big fan of Kier Starmer and his current
new management, as he calls it.
New management, the campaign to abandon all of his original promises. That he's actually doing a pretty good job in managing to just like forget all of them, I think. But like, do you see some of the sort of more left-wing momentum-y Jeremy Corbyn side of Labour breaking off and forming a new party? Because this is something I've been looking at recently, and like whether we're going to get like another or maybe 2 or 3 sort of parties that will spring up between now and the next election.
I don't think it will happen, in the sense that I mean, the famous phrase is the Labour Party is a broad church, and that has been the case for decades. I think.
I mean, like, there's a broad church, and then there's agreeing with everything the Tories say. There's like,
I mean, that's what frustrates me is, and I know I'm increasingly seeing. Sorry, I'm increasingly seeing people are leaving the Labour Party because they're just so disenchanted. I mean, I've been a member throughout, I say, right back to the 80s, and I stayed loyal to the party when Blair was leader. I mean, I stopped being active, but I still believed in the Labour Party, even though I didn't believe in the current leadership. I mean, I was suspended from the Labour Party in 2016. About 10,000 people were suspended during the Jeremy Corbyn's second leadership election because of comments on social media. And basically people, the anti-Corbyn faction at Party HQ just trawled social media, and basically anybody who retweeted particular tweets they didn't like got suspended for bringing the party into disrepute. In fact, the evidence they sent me, it wasn't any comments I'd made myself. It was 2 retweets, and the evidence they sent to me showed I hadn't even retweeted them. And I battled with them for what? And it was a nightmare. And then we all miraculously got, well, nearly all of us got unsuspended about a month after the leadership election. And there was talk, I mean, it might sound like a crazy conspiracy theory, but I mean, I don't know if you have heard about the Labour Leaks report that came out when
Yeah. I spoke to Rory O'Donnell, who was a staffer in Corbyn's, I don't know if I would say inner circle, but he ran the battle bus in 2019. So he's a friend of mine. I used to work with him. So yeah, I'm aware of the leaks report.
So I mean, the thing, so that report came out back in April, about the time Kier Starmer became leader, and it was showing there was actually a unit within Labour Party HQ at the 2017 general election, which was actually putting funding towards what were called the moderate Labour MPs, the anti-Corbyn ones, the people who'd been part of the attempt in the PLP to bring him down. And arguably, we came quite close. We moved the Tories majority. If we had a more focused campaign, we could arguably have won the election, which is causing a lot of argument. So yes, I mean, I saw just before we started talking, I saw on Twitter, Angela Rayner was asked this morning about the NHS pay rise, and she said, "Oh well, we went Labour offered 5% last election, but we lost, so we're not committing to a figure now." And I mean, the Green Party's recently come out; they support the 15% pay rise. It really is quite demotivating.
What would 15%?
I just don't. Sorry, again.
What would 15% be for like a minimum wage person? That would be what, up to about 10 or 11 pounds an hour, something like that.
I think. Yeah, sorry, I hadn't thought in terms of per hour, but
no, it was just popped in my head, like what would you be earning generally? Well, like what would be the minimum wage?
I mean, nearly every. I don't think there's many people in the NHS on minimum wage. I think it's above minimum wage, the bottom scales. But then alongside that, people working in care work, a lot of people in care work are on minimum wage, which does get overlooked.
Quite often they're on a lot less than minimum wage because they're the time to fill their
because
doesn't add up to the
that's the problem. The private care companies will only pay you literally for the hours you're with that. The local authority care will actually pay you'll get a shift and you'll do so many hours and you'll get paid for the travel time between. But so I mean, it's just the lack of ambition that let's say, just mention Angela Rayner because she's been on the telly this morning. The lack of ambition, the lack of Kier Starmer. It's this. I think it's the idea is that Jeremy Corbyn was presented by the media as being dreadfully extreme, far too radical. But a lot of the policies that Labour were advocating in the 2 general elections he led us into were pretty much mainstream social democratic policies across a lot of Scandinavia, across a lot of Europe. And it's the idea that we should have a fully funded public NHS, that we should start to think about taking some of the utilities back into public ownership. It wasn't dangerously radical. It was just the sort of stuff that decades ago people just did. It was mainstream politics back in the 70s. So I feel that Kier Starmer and his team are trying to make Labour appear moderate, and I've heard them say we need to be a critical friend of the government during the pandemic. No, you should be jumping up and down every day, pointing to all the corruption, and the failures, and the massive scale of the death toll. And I'll always stay loyal to Labour, because I just feel like, to come to your question about will there be a split, I don't think there will be, because there hasn't been one in the past. And you see people like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, and there's the Socialist Campaign Group within the Parliamentary Labour Party. They've got about 25 MPs who are the sort of the strong left-wing group. They're all staying loyal, because I don't think in the space of 3.5 years till the next general election, it sounds an attractive proposition. We'll have a radical socialist party that will be a clear alternative to Tories, but I just don't think that you can achieve that and win in the general election. I think the battle has to be for radical socialists to hopefully keep arguing their case within the Labour Party, and hopefully some of the policies, and not just the policies, but like you said, the general thrust of the image the Labour Party is putting across. It just needs to be more radical and a lot more challenging to the government. And the problem is, like, I know we shouldn't believe opinion polls, because we shouldn't, but it's the Conservatives just keep on being ahead of Labour in the opinion polls, despite the scale of the pandemic, despite so many things that are happening, despite the fact that the Brexit, and I probably don't want to get into all the exacts of Brexit, but however, whatever you felt about Brexit, for or against it, the promises they've made, and, I used to have a litany. I said, people said, oh, Brexit. I said, well, the Tories said, if you vote yes in the referendum, we'll trigger Article 50, and within 2 years we'll have a trade deal. We won't be paying a divorce payment. We'll leave the single market. We'll leave the customs union. We'll have loads of wonderful new trade deals around the world. We'll have £350 million a week extra that we'll spend on the NHS. And it took, nearly 5 years on for the referendum. We've only recently left a transition period. So the many things they promised, some of them didn't happen, and those that did happen took a lot longer to happen than they said they would. And increasingly, again, just obviously you're in Northern Ireland, just the simple mechanics of trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because of they had the backstop, which, it seemed to me an eminently sensible solution, in terms of where we are, but they were opposed to this, so they created a slightly different scenario that Boris Johnson could say, I've negotiated a better deal than Theresa May, and well, the reality of it isn't working, and there's already figures coming out showing sort of like, both in terms of the GBNI trade blockages, and also that some of the exports from Britain to continental Europe are slowing. So yeah. I feel the thing that frustrates me is I feel that I watch, obviously I get a lot of my news from Twitter and social media and generally, and the independent media, and then I turn on the BBC and ITV News, and it's like, the thing that frustrates me is it's portrayed that I feel the Johnson government is really dangerous and really extreme and really both simultaneously incompetent in many ways, but dangerously following a very nasty, nationalistic, selfish agenda. And people in the media, it's like the sanitized, it's like, they prorogued Parliament. They tried to close Parliament down for 5 weeks to stop scrutiny of Brexit. And it's not a normal government. To me, I'm really into political history. I think we are in a situation where the last time we had a government this incompetent and dangerous. We're going back to sort of the Baldwin Chamberlain era of the 30s when they were appeasing fascism, and we had mass unemployment, and we ended up with a war that we weren't prepared for. I just think
everything turned all right.
Again, sorry?
Everything turned out all right there. You know,
well, it took 6 years to win the war, didn't it? Which we should have, I hope you're not being too serious about that. But the thing is, I just do really feel that it's almost like Johnson has seen what Trump has done. And it used to be the thing is politicians would tell lies, but they couldn't lie day after day about major things where there was evidence to show they were lying and get away with it. And it's like I said, because of the prorogation of Parliament, because in the latter part of Theresa May being Prime Minister, the government was actually in contempt of Parliament for refusing to release documentation they were told to release about the Brexit deal, because Dominic Cummings wouldn't answer questions about the funding of the Brexit referendum and was in contempt of Parliament, was still allowed to be the Prime Minister's chief advisor. And then he broke lockdown. It wasn't until 6 months later he upset Boris Johnson's partner, then he had to go. But it's almost as though no government minister, I mean, Priti Patel was accused of breaking the ministerial code by bullying civil servants. Boris Johnson just said, no, I've made the judgment. The independent report says she broke the code, but I've made the judgment she didn't. Matt Hancock, as I said earlier, broke the law. Johnson repeatedly lies to Parliament. None of these people resign. I remember like the Thatcher and Major era, loads of government ministers had to resign during John Major's cataclysmic time in office because of sleaze and scandal and incompetence, but it just doesn't happen anymore. They're just not being held to sort of accountable standards that we expect.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty disgusting. I want to take this opportunity before we wrap up here, actually, to plug my book, Brexit, the Establishment Civil War, because I talk in the end a lot about, and I'm not sure I would call it nationalistic as much as Trump's kind of quite overt America First thing was, but there's the thing that concerns me most is the quite extreme free market neoliberalism that is embraced by the almost the entirety of the cabinet. My book basically talks about how social media was used first to exploit a whole bunch of divisions in order to successfully, campaign for Brexit, and now it will be used to further privatize and sell off what remains of the British state. So if you want to hear all about that fun story, go and order my book. The link is in the description below. So Andrew, is there something you want to plug before we finish up here?
Well, I was tempted to say, I did, if we're plugging books, I did write, I've got a copy here just to hand because I was just reading it before we started talking. Why not? Oh, hang on, I'm holding that. Why not trust the Conservatives? It's a book I wrote. It was published in 2015, which is actually a critical history of the Conservative Party. I started off with I wrote originally many years ago, and then I rewrote it with the naive belief that if I wrote a book about how dreadful the Conservative Party is, people would buy it and read it, and it might have influence. It was by no means a bestseller, but when I'm feeling, I do actually plan to do an update this year. I'm sort of writing an update, so. Well, anyway, I said for me, politics. You probably got the gist of it from maybe your podcast. For me, politics and history are very much intertwined, and there is a lot to be learned from looking at making comparisons, past and present, and just understanding why things happen and the roots of how things happen. And so that's just my belief that if we learn from the mistakes of the past, hopefully we will not repeat them and hopefully do things better in the future. Or as I said before, in terms of the NHS, we look at when it worked better and just go back to those values, really. So anyway, many thanks for talking. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, not a problem. That feels like a nice positive note on which to end.
Right.
So check out Andrew's books. I will link everything in the description below. So thanks very much.
Right. All right, great. Thanks.
No problem.
Cheers.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, or sign up to our mailing list. Thanks a lot to our sponsor, ExpressVPN, the #1 most trusted VPN. Get lightning fast connectivity with servers in 160 locations across 94 countries. Keep your browsing privacy safe with ExpressVPN and get a 35% discount on 12 months of ExpressVPN when you follow the link in the description below. Don't forget my book is now out and available to order on Amazon and on bookshop.org. That's Brexit, the Establishment Civil War. And most importantly, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.